Now, one other element in that, of course the language of sacrifice is much older than 1,000 years ago. It's there in the Old Testament, it's there in the New Testament. But it's important to realize that the language of sacrifice by itself does not mean substitution. In the Old Testament, in Jewish practice, the sacrifice of animals was never about God really wanted the life of the human being, but he'll take it out on the goat instead. So one of the problems we in the modern church have is that many of us who have become disenchanted or worse with the notion of substitutionary sacrifice is that a good number of us still think substitution whenever we hear the word sacrifice or the word atonement. So I also want to underline sacrifice and atonement are not identical with substitution, even though the most common understanding today plugs substitution into the language of sacrifice and atonement. And then why did it become so popular? I have no idea. It's kind of neat, though, when you think about it. We don't have to go through the cross. Jesus did it for us.
Pick up a word that Marcus used earlier, and then my word, metaphor. Be terribly careful of the metaphors you use for God. We can only speak of God in metaphors. Let's get that straight. But be careful of the metaphors. Matrix, the matrix of the 11th century. St. Anselm was born in Norman territory. The Normans took England in 1066. He was appointed, I think he was the second Archbishop of Canterbury. He couldn't even speak Anglo-Saxon. He was appointed by a Norman king of England. The Pope caught up a little bit later by going along with it, but he was appointed by the king. His metaphor for God is feudal lord. That's the metaphor that dominates his thinking absolutely. He is the first baron of the realm. He's not just an archbishop, you know. He takes armies down to the Channel ports to protect them when the king's beating up the Scots. He's a baron. So his metaphor for God, and this is faithful, F-A-T-E, full, is feudal lord. And a feudal lord can't simply say, any more than a federal judge can, walk into court and say, you're all forgiven. In his world, the honor, the order of the universe depends on the honor of that feudal lord. Feudal lord just can't do it. Well, couldn't you have a nice feudal lord who'd say, no, we can't have a nice judge who goes in and forgives everyone. So watch your metaphors. This was the most unfortunately successful metaphor for God in the history of Christianity. And it comes straight out of Normandy.
The Normans were French-speaking Vikings, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kent Pruitt. My question is the reference that Jesus uses about being the Son of Man. That comes from the Old Testament, if I remember correctly. What is the significance of using that designation, Son of Man? And you...
Go ahead. As succinctly as possible, think of our two words, empire and eschaton. The place where you can see that matrix together is in Daniel chapter 7, when the empires are the Babylonian, the Median, the Persian, the Greek, and the little pipsqueak empire of the Syrians are simply beasts from the sea. They're not even human phenomenon. Whereas the one like a human being, or in Hebrew Aramaic chauvinism, one like a son of man, is the one who is given the kingdom to bring it down to the saints of the Most High on earth. It's the anti-kingdom to the imperial rule. And when Jesus appears on earth as the Son of Man, it's sometimes mistaken to mean that means he's a human being. Of course he's a human being. But Son of Man is an, even if anything, more transcendental title than Son of God, because it means the one to whom in Daniel 7, God has given the kingdom to bring it down to earth for us. So if the Son of Man is here, the kingdom's here.
Jesus acted his life a life of love. He forgave, even though it's kicked around in the book, the lady who was caught in adultery, no punishment. He accepted her. Paul wrote eloquently about love in 1 Corinthians 13, but he evidently wanted to get rid of the homosexuals and the ones that were disobeying the Jewish law in the early church. What would a church look like that could teach how to love with equal fervor as we do of catechisms and confessions of faith from Paul and Jesus?
The trouble with the word love is it's the most precious word in the English language and also the most vacuous. You have to use it for your favorite candy bar and the soulmate of your life. I would like to bring together justice, meaning distributive justice, and love. And the way I think to do it is that justice, now always meaning distributive justice, is the flesh and body of love, and that love is the spirit and the soul of justice. When you separate body and soul, you get a corpse. What we have done in Christianity is separate justice and love, and therefore we get a corpse. We don't get either.
I think that your point about the story of Jesus forgiving the woman taken in adultery in the Gospel of John is a good one, in that there is forgiveness offered there without any penance or compensation or payment being made. And if we take Jesus as the decisive revelation of God, then that also suggests that the character of God is compassion or love, and that God is not a punitive God. And I think that's tremendously important. I think any time the Christian gospel portrays God as a punitive God, you've kind of left Christianity. Now, I want to add one thing to that, and it builds on Dom's comment that love can be such a vapid, vacuous, sentimental term. The content of what it means to love for Christians is what we see in Jesus. In other words, Jesus defines love. It's not that love as we understand it is kind of what Jesus was about. And if we see Jesus as the decisive revelation of God's character, then we realize that God doesn't just love the world, but in words that Robert Frost suggested might be inscribed on his own tombstone, he had a lover's quarrel with the world. I think that's a magnificent description of the God of the Bible. God has a lover's quarrel with the world. And I think that is what drives the passion of Jesus. That Jesus' own passion was for a transformed world. And a transformed world is about more than individuals being nice to each other, or forgiving each other, or loving each other. It's about the transformation of the world in the direction of justice and peace. So I would say that we always need to remember that justice is the social form of love, and love without justice is kind of about happy families.
I think it would be much better if in general, and in the Bible as well, we could get rid of the war metaphors, even terms like victory. I think struggle is a more accurate term of what we're trying to do. So even when it's used in the Bible, even when it could be justified by saying it's not their type of armament, but our type of armament.
You said a little bit about distributive justice a moment ago. Could you maybe expand on that and tell us about how, with the different cultures, different religions, we can achieve distributive justice in our society?
Well, basically, where the Bible gets its vision of distributive justice is not from our ideas of human rights or anything like that. It's not there. It begins with what all of us have some experience of. It's called the household. They might say the father, but that's simply a gendered term for the household or the householder. They're simply asking, what does a well-run household look like? I think you could ask that across a lot of cultures and come up with a similar answer. A well-run household, I have to be very general. The kids will be well-fed, well-protected, well-sheltered. The animals, lands, fields, ice packs, whatever, to bring in everyone you can think of, has to be taken care of. Then you would praise the name of the householder. You'd say, nice job. They simply take that up to transcendental proportions and think of God as the householder, or the father, they will say in gender terms, of the world house. What does a well-run household look like? If you looked around the world, would you say, nice job, God? Or would you say, good God? So that's really the way they're thinking, honestly. They're thinking that way. Now, if they put in, say, the king in between, the king should be the ideal householder of the land house, the land of Israel. And therefore, justice and righteousness and all that stuff keeps coming up. That's where they get their image from. Now, I think that's something that most people have some understanding of. What's a decent home like? Even if it's not theirs, they have some vision of what it should be. So I don't think it's so difficult to say, is everything in the home distributed fairly? It's not, does everyone get exactly the same amount of food? But does a sick child get much more care than a healthy child, maybe? So those are the questions, and by that, the world house fails pretty dismally.
And to add to that, I think the way we move to a more just society in this country, or at least the way Christians can play a role in that, is through education in local congregations about how central that concern is in the Bible as a whole, the Old Testament and the New Testament alike. Distributive justice is, in some sense, a very simple notion. That the way the world is put together, meaning the structures of society, including the economic system, the educational system, all of this stuff, that it should be fair. And that this is utterly central to the passion of God and to Jesus' own passion for the kingdom of God. It's about fairness. And fairness has to do with everybody should have enough. Not as the result of charity, but as the product of the way the system is put together. And again, that need not mean, in fact, does not mean everybody gets exactly the same. And so these conversations need to happen at the congregational level about the Bible's dream of justice and peace. We need to do education and consciousness raising about this. And we also need to be aware we're going to encounter resistance. That's why it's so important to let the Bible speak about this. Because people can easily dismiss an adult education teacher or a clergy person who just talks about this because it's just some liberal ideas they learned in seminary, or they're politically left. But if they actually see this in the Bible, not just once, but all over the place, then it's like, it's really there.